Topic 8.2 is titled The Cold War. And the essential question we're answering in this topic is, what were the causes and effects of the Cold War? I'm going to go through both sides, the two main players, that is, of the Cold War, and kind of discuss from each side some major events that were kind of formative in the course of the Cold War. So on the U.S. side, our engagement with the Cold War really begins, not entirely begins, but begins in earnest with Truman Doctrine. That's a 1947 declaration by President Truman that the U.S. would follow interventionist foreign policy across the world to contain communism, to contain the spread of communism. You can see that same year is when we begin a period of time in the United States called the Red Scare, where there was widespread persecution of progressives in the U.S. During the Cold War, and that was led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. You may have heard the term McCarthyism to refer to this time. You can see on the screen in front of you the political cartoon on the left is meant to depict the risk he was saying existed to the United States. Next, we have kind of a building on Truman Doctrine, and that's President Eisenhower's domino theory. And this was the idea, as you can see on the screen, there's an image as well that shows you kind of a depiction of what this theory was. But the idea was that as one country falls to communism, the others around it would be likely to do the same. And so in 1954, President Eisenhower stated this again as a justification for U.S. military interventions around the world to prevent the spread of communism. So you can kind of see the growth from Truman Doctrine, but along the same lines and for the same reason. Speaking of President Eisenhower, on his way out of office in his farewell address, he actually warned the country about something he called the military-industrial complex. And that's really just the relationship that exists between the military and the companies that supply the military, and reckoning with the fact that for them at least, there can be a certain benefit to conflict, that there can be a desire to engage in conflict because it's beneficial for them, but also just the inherent kind of nature of the relationship can bring them a little too close together and make them a little bit too powerful. And he warned the United States against that military-industrial complex becoming too powerful. And it's a concept you'll still hear through this day as we continue to, vastly lead the world in military spending, is a questioning of this relationship in the United States. So then we move to the idea of deterrence, and specifically nuclear deterrence. But that's the stockpiling of weapons for the purposes of preventing war, preventing violence. And it's related to another concept called mutually assured destruction, the idea that two nuclear states would not engage with each other militarily because of the risk of annihilation from the other side or from both sides. We got very close to that annihilation in the early 60s. So in 1961, under President Kennedy, we had the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a small-scale invasion of Cuba, a small group of U.S. soldiers, special forces, that landed in Cuba with the intention of fomenting a revolution, essentially, or at least helping participate in a revolution which they thought would happen. It did not happen, and those soldiers ended up getting captured, or worse in some of the instances. A year later, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the United States found out that the Soviets were helping the Cubans build essentially a nuclear missile system from Cuba. You can see on the map on the screen in front of you a map from the Cold War era showing the range that they believed these missiles could go. And you can see that the United States was within most of that, except for the kind of northwestern coast. And so starting in 1962, the U.S. blockaded Cuba in response to this. It was a very tense period of time. There was a genuine risk that we would go to war with the USSR, but the USSR ended up deciding that it wasn't a good idea at that moment in time and backing down. After that period, really toward the end of the 60s, we reach a period of time called détente. And that was a calming of hostilities, basically, between the USSR, the intentional calming of hostilities. The idea was that we had, let this relationship get too toxic, too bitter, and we needed to fix it. And so we started working on that. And you can see just kind of shortly thereafter, early 70s, we had a similar type change in our relationship with China. This was under Nixon. We entered a period called rapprochement, where we were trying to normalize our relationship with China, which at that same time was undergoing some changes in its relationship to the USSR. When President Reagan took power in the 1980s, in 1980, he came to office as a conservative, hardline right-winger, and as a part of that, he ended détente. And his goal was to rapidly increase military spending and the size of the U.S. military to put pressure on the USSR. This, in some circles, is kind of pegged as the thing that ended the Cold War, and that's certainly a point for debate. But it was a contributing factor either way, because we forced the USSR to spend big to kind of keep up with us, and they weren't able to do so based on many factors internally. So now we'll shift over to the USSR. Hopefully by now you know that they're really formed out of this group called the Bolsheviks, which was formed by Lenin. They're kind of a political party, political faction, you'll see them called. And they took power in 1917 following the October Revolution as a part of the Russian Revolution. Lenin introduced something called New Economic Policy. You'll see it listed as NEP, and it's a term you should know. That's from 1921, the kind of reforming of the Soviet economic system to merge some elements of capitalism, actually, in free markets, but under state control, kind of more similar to what we see China is set up as today. And so for a brief period of time, this was the kind of set of policies that they were following. But after Lenin's death and the ascent of Stalin, these policies were abandoned, I believe it was 1928. But initially, at least, that was the goal, and that was the model that they were going to follow. Under Stalin, you should know about the Gulag. That was a network of forced labor camps, essentially a modern type of slavery that was used not only as a source of labor, but also as a very effective tool for the repression of political dissent. So anyone that was kind of seen as an enemy of the USSR, which could be really just about anyone on any given day, could find themselves in this network of prisons called the Gulag. It wasn't one place, it was a whole network. That was kind of dismantled in the period following Stalin's rule. We go through this period called de-Stalinization, where the USSR tried to become a little bit less harsh, essentially. And so that was the kind of breakdown of the Gulag system, or the unwinding of the Gulag system was part of that. It's around that same time that we enter the space race between the U.S. and the USSR. Early on, you would certainly say the USSR was winning. They were the first to get a satellite in space, first to put a person in space, but we were the first to the moon and tend to hang our hat on that. But either way, this was another kind of layer of the rivalry between these two states as they approached kind of a growing conflict. So as I said, you did have that period of de-Stalinization that followed Stalin's rule, and then kind of after that, we enter this period called the era of stagnation. It was a period of kind of intense economic decline in the USSR. The economic system was changed. Remember, the Gulag was dismantled, and that was a source of free labor. I'm not saying that that's the only cause, but certainly was a cause, as well as the arms race being a cause, because the Soviet Union continued having to invest heavily in arms. Even as we went through détente and even as we tried to have that cooling of relations, there still was the understanding that we were still kind of enemies that needed to have a countervailing pressure or force against. I mentioned before some changes to the Soviet-Chinese relationship, and that really comes to a head in the 1960s. It starts in the 1950s, but in 1969 there was a border skirmish between the Soviets and the Chinese. And that led to what's called the Sino-Soviet split, essentially a breaking of those two states and the Chinese deciding to engage more with the United States and seeing Russia or seeing the USSR more and more as a threat to them instead of a natural ally, as both being communist. When we jump ahead now to toward the end of the USSR, we have two terms you definitely need to know: glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost is just the increasing of transparency, with the opening up of the USSR, so it's even its own citizens could better understand what was going on. And perestroika is a little bit harder of a kind of term to peg, but it's really the restructuring of the USSR in ways that sought to kind of make it a more equitable and a better place to live, essentially, with more opportunity. These reforms were part of a general reform posture that's associated with the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who led the USSR through this transition to its end, essentially. So that brings us to the Malta Summit, which was really getting toward the end of the Cold War. That was a meeting following the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now remember, it starts being deconstructed in 1990, but in 1989 is when they agreed to dismantle it. And so that was a meeting between then President Bush, President Reagan's successor, and Gorbachev, which officially ended, although again, this is not really ended, but was the intention to end, really, the Cold War and the hostilities between the two states. All right, lastly, let's talk about the non-aligned movement real quick. Remember, these are states that chose not to side with the Soviets or the U.S. This starts at the Bandung Conference, which was in Indonesia in 1955. That was a meeting of Asian and African states and was seen as a precursor to the non-aligned movement, but wasn't where it started. The non-aligned movement, as I said, leaders seeking neutrality from these two sides. It's really started officially by India, Indonesia, and Ghana. And specific people you should know is India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, and Ghana's first president/prime minister, Kwame Nkrumah. All three of those are names you should know and associate with this time, and also just with kind of general anti-imperialism kind of overall. Sukarno helped fight against the Dutch and win independence for Indonesia. Kwame Nkrumah fought in West Africa for West African liberation from the French and to a lesser extent the British. But both of them are kind of revolutionary figures in this time that you should know and understand their contribution not just to the non-aligned movement, but to the general changes in power structures that followed.